Welcome to everyone to the University of Texas Energy Symposium for February 2nd. Today we have Paul Brockway from University of Leeds across the pond. But before I introduce Paul and his talk, I will point out the talk for next week, which is Hao Zhu. She is an assistant professor here at the University of Texas at Austin in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering, and she's going to teach us about spatiotemporal learning for enhancing situational awareness of the power grid. So how do we know what's going on at different places in the power grid, and how do we use information from the grid to know that, particularly as we go to more distributed devices and battery storage? How do we know the local conditions of the grid to maintain stability? So we're going to learn more about that. The two talks after that will be talks from the private sector, Rayford Smith from Google and Akshay Roy from Yardi Systems, who they work on building system management. Today, it's a pleasure to have Paul Brockway. Paul is a colleague, and we confer and work together in a group that discusses energy and economic issues. So it's taking advantage of our remote capabilities now to have Paul speak from Leeds. He is a university academic fellow at the University of Leeds. And today he's going to talk about energy efficiency and Exergy. So I'll probably, explain maybe what Exergy means, and thinking about Exergy economics and the role of efficiency, and how do we think about how that relates to GDP in terms of what he's going to discuss as decoupling. Can we grow GDP or the economy? Do we have to grow our energy consumption or not? So at the moment, so he works at the Sustainability Research Institute at the University of Leeds as an academic fellow, and he has a 5-year project now on the applying thermodynamic laws to the energy GDP coupling problem. So this is right up his alley, and he's going to tell us what he knows about this at the moment. So with that said, I will stop talking and I will hand it over to Paul, and I will remind everyone while he starts to share his screen that submit questions at any time via the Q&A feature of the Zoom chat, and I will be asking these questions at the end of Paul's talk. So again, please submit questions via the Q&A feature. And with that said, Paul, go ahead.
Great, cheers, Kerry. Hopefully I'm coming through okay, and yeah, you can hear and see my slides okay.
Right, yep.
Perfect. So yeah, so we're kind of midway through my 5-year project, looking at the role of energy efficiency in economic growth and decoupling. So this is a kind of like a midway point in terms of what we've found so far. I guess my backstory is that I spent about 15 years after graduating in engineering designing buildings, and spent a couple of years in Ethiopia teaching civil engineering. And then kind of came back and then read Limits to Growth around 2005. And then my whole world kind of turned upside down at that point. I thought, oh, this doesn't look very good. So I kind of then moved through a master's, a PhD, got out of kind of designing buildings and infrastructure, and then started to spend the last, I guess, nearly 10 years now looking at particularly this kind of subject, looking at energy rebound, energy efficiency, because something didn't feel quite right. Even 10, 15 years ago, thinking about, well, surely we need to be using less energy rather than more, but all our energy keeps going up every year. So something's kind of not working because we've got lots of energy efficiency. So I guess this is kind of research from the last couple of years, but equally is bringing in things from even before that. So bear with me, because it's a bit of a kind of a bumpy road, looking at, there's quite a few things to unpack here, even aside from whether GDP is a good metric or not, looking at our productivity. But this is our journey. So we're looking at whether the illusory faith in energy efficiency to decouple energy and GDP. That's our topic. Okay, here we go. Right. So we're going to look at this topic. I've shortened it to the decoupling illusion, because that's easier to say than the main title. And we're going to unpack it in several stages. And I'm not going to put up the whole thing because I don't want to kill the punchlines at the end. And I'm going to start by looking at whether we've really got a blind faith in energy efficiency. What is it based on? the fact that everybody believes energy efficiency is kind of a solution to so many things and can reduce our energy use. This is a plot from the International Energy Agency, the IEA, and this is typical of a lot of global energy projections. So you can see that essentially under sort of current or new policies that energy use kind of goes up, but then there's this kind of big blue wedge in this case, which is through energy efficiency, energy use is going down, and then we have renewables as a kind of second dial to reduce CO2 emissions, and then everything else is CCS and other kind of things, which fuel switching, which enable us to reduce CO2 emissions down to a level which is a set target for whatever year we want, whether it's net zero in 2050 is our current UK target. But the key point is that this big blue wedge is quite a leap of faith in terms of saying we're going to have lots of energy efficiency and it's going to reduce our energy use, and then the other dials essentially don't have to work as hard. And as we tightened our targets towards meeting a 1.5 or below 2 degree Paris target, increasingly these projections are assuming absolute decoupling. And what I mean by that is that GDP is still allowed to grow under the forecasts, but the energy is going down. So they are decoupling. One's going up and the other is going down, which sounds fine. And indeed, there are policy mechanisms all over the world. Europe is one where one of the main pillars of energy policy is related to reducing energy use through energy efficiency alongside CO2 targets and shares of renewables. So, you know, it seems something that everybody can sign up to. And worldwide, there are lots of organizations and lots of policy makers which have a kind of not a vested interest, but also have a faith that energy efficiency is the very first thing that we should be doing. We'll be reducing energy, and then everything else gets easier as a result of that. So there are a lot of people betting, not a lot of money, but a lot of people that are envisaged that the future is in a much more energy efficient and lower energy use global energy system. And that there are benefits that stem beyond just greenhouse gas emissions and energy savings. So the IEA has a famous graphic that I'm showing here from 5 or 6 years ago, where not only were there energy and greenhouse gas emission savings, but there was envisaged improvements to a whole bunch of other things. If energy use goes down, people have more money in their pocket, they can spend more money, they have higher disposable incomes, air quality improves because you're using less energy, less fossil fuel emissions are going up, so health and well-being improves, poverty is improved, industrial productivity, and so on and so forth. So in many ways, with such a raft of improvements and benefits, what's not to like about energy efficiency? And surely this is obviously what's going to happen in the future, that we have lots of energy efficiency measures brought in worldwide, energy goes down, and then renewables, CCS, and other kind of policy levers don't have to work as hard. And this way it starts to get a little bit more interesting. So the reality is that there has been no global historical absolute energy GDP decoupling in the past. And yet that's exactly what that model was projecting in the future. Let's have a look at this in a couple of stages. So if we look at, this is a plot of, we've got a couple of plots. This is from a paper in 2016. The GDP per capita, as GDP per capita rises, then so does energy use per capita. And that seems fairly intuitive, that might be the case. This is sorted by country. So the largest blob you can guess is where you are, over in the US. And then this is India, and sorry, that's China, and then India is a slightly smaller one here. But essentially, the rich countries are over here in the highest corner, and there's a pretty good straight line in between the top one and heading down towards the bottom. So at a per capita level, there's a tight kind of correlation between energy consumption and GDP. And at a world level, when you plot things in terms of not absolute levels, but plot them in growth rates, we see an interesting picture. So this is a growth rate plot. So here we have growth rate of primary energy. So these are in percentage terms. So this is 2%, 4%, 6% per year. And this is growth rate of GDP, 2%, 4%, 6% per year. So in this case, there was a growth rate in that particular year of nearly 7% GDP, and energy grew at just over 2%. But the world average, this is over the last 45 or so, 50 years, back to 1960, is the world average is somewhere around here. So this is about 3.5%, just over 3% growth in GDP here, and about a 2% growth rate in primary energy. But importantly, what really occupies every single point in here for the last 50, nearly 60 years now, occupies its space in this between coupled, where energy use and GDP grow exactly together, and where it's completely decoupled, where GDP grows by itself, but energy doesn't increase at all. And this is a space called relative decoupling. So energy grows, but not quite at the pace of GDP. So GDP, as I say, has grown by just over 3% per year since around 1960, whereas energy use has grown by about 2% per year. So that's a relative decoupling. Whereas importantly, what the models are wanting in the future, what they're projecting in the future, is that we're in this space. Every single year between now and 2050, we should be heading to and into an absolute decoupling space. But the important point from a historical record is there has been not a single year where that has happened in the past 50 years. And yet that's exactly the space where all the models are pointing to for the future. So that's the first kind of alarm bell to think, something's not quite right here. Something needs a bit more investigating as to why that might be the case. I worked on a systematic review as part of a whole bunch of other authors in the last year or so, and we looked at the systematic review of energy and material resources and the extent to which they decouple from GDP, as well as GDP and greenhouse gas emissions, the extent to which the outputs or the impacts have decoupled. And we screened originally around 10,000 papers, and we got down to about 800 that we finally reviewed that met all the criteria we wanted. And what we found was, this is a plot of, again, relationships, and we have higher income countries and lower income countries. And if there was an absolute coupling, so in other words, if energy and GDP went up in step, they would be occupying this red line here. If there's no relationship at all, so if the GDP was growing, but there's no increase to energy in this case, or materials or CO2, they would be on this line 0. And what we find is that energy occupies the space in between. So again, it's back to this relative decoupling space for the rich countries, and an even tighter, closer to absolute coupling space for the lower income countries, because they're producing a lot of the goods that we're buying. And so therefore, there's this kind of trading effect between the two. So again, what we found was that essentially, that at best, individual countries have achieved relative decoupling between GDP and resource use. But there was some local decoupling for CO2, but again, there's a bit of offshoring going in there, as well as a whole bunch of renewables. So what we find is growing support that actually there hasn't been any absolute decoupling in the past, which is important, as I say, when we have the future, and we're relying on a lot of decoupling, absolute decoupling to happen in the future. So go back to our plot that we had before, where we had energy going up, or in this case, CO2 emissions going up. We have lots of efficiency, renewables, and then the other kind of sector of dials. And so what about energy models? What do they suggest is going to be happening in the future? And what we find is that increasingly, as I say, that models are tightening their assumptions towards absolute decoupling. So this is nearly hot off the press. This is a paper that we've been working on on and off in the last 2, maybe nearly 3 years since its original gestation. These things tend to have quite long periods of time to formulate. And what we did here was we plotted energy use against GDP. For the historical record is in the black dots, and then we plotted the projections for energy and GDP for energy economy models, important ones that the IPCC use. That's these SSP scenarios here. The green ones are the 1.5 Paris targets, and the purple ones are the 2-degree Paris targets. So we see here the purple ones are up here, the green ones are starting to get tighter, and there are some other ones here from the IEA and other external parties as well. But we see everything starting to move to the right-hand side, which means that GDP is still growing in their scenarios, but the energy demand is starting to slow. So it's not following the historical line, which is almost pretty linear for those last 50 years, but it's actually moving to the right. So GDP is assumed in models to grow. Energy is either slowing or, in some cases, starting to go down. And we see this a little bit more clearly with the next slide, also in a paper which is coming out hopefully in the next 2 weeks, if we can get it through the proofers are just looking at it at the moment. This is a plot of energy intensity change rate. So remember that I said that GDP is growing by like 3% per year in the past. Energy is growing by about 2% per year in the past. So the change rate of energy, 2%, divided by the change rate of GDP, 3%, gives you a change rate in energy intensity, energy over GDP, of about -1% per year. And this is essentially the global average of energy intensity for the last 100 years or more has been around this border of between 1 and 2% per year. So energy use has been growing, but GDP has been growing faster. It's slowing down slightly now. We see heading back towards 1% in terms of energy intensity change rates. But importantly, all the models, remember in the last slide that we had these really sharp turn rights and in fact going down in some cases. That shows up really clearly on the energy intensity change rate. We actually see that there's a whole bunch of models around here that are forecasting the next decade, particularly, to have energy intensity change rates of higher than 3% or more per year. And remember back here that there hasn't been, sorry, looking at the historical stuff, there hasn't been a single year in the last 50 years where it's been above 3% per year. And yet all of these, some of these models are now showing much higher increases in or reductions in energy intensity. So this area here, again, is a big concern in terms of future models are projecting rapid changes in energy intensity, which has no historical relationship or no historical basis. So either the models are assuming something completely different in the way that we've designed our energy systems and efficiency, or there's something missing in the models that is not going back and is in step with the historical reality. So this is another concern, that the models, and these are the IPCC and other models which are informing the policies that are being made globally. So something is not quite as it seems in this space. When we look at the more clearly the energy intensity change rates, we find for the IPCC model averages, this next decade has an average intensity change rate of -3, just under -3% per year, and the other scenario models are at -2% per year. But remember, that -3% per year is beyond just, okay, there's 2 years, I'll give you that, 2 years out of the last 50 that have had final energy intensity change rates at that level. And yet that's the average for every year for the whole suite of those models that are in existence. So there's something that's not quite as we would seem. So let's just say that they are very optimistic about the intensity reductions, particularly over the next decade. Okay, so that's the first 2 bits. So we've covered the kind of essentially the backstory as to our blind faith in energy efficiency, and we've had a look to say, well, actually, the reliance on absolute reductions in energy use in the future doesn't actually meet with the historical record. So the next stage is to start to explore why this might be the case. And so in our paper, we've been, we've been working on the last couple of years. We've now been exploring the idea that there is large economy-wide rebound that could exist as a plausible explanation, both for why energy and GDP might be tightly coupled in the past, but also the absence of rebound in these models could explain why there's suddenly this disconnect, that they allow energy reductions to be occurring because there's not as much rebound in the models as there should be. But before we get to that, there's a couple of things we have to go through first. I just want to take you on a kind of a historical journey. Okay, so there's 2 fallacies I think that I want to set out. Okay, you may disagree, but let's go with it anyway. Firstly, the first fallacy is that people believe that mainstream economic models properly include the potential role of energy in economic growth. And it's simply, I don't think that's simply not true. So we go back to Robert Solow back in 1957 when he set out the aggregate production function, where he could explain where he thought he could explain the economic output of a given country was essentially related to capital and labor and nothing else, except that there was a large chunk of, in fact, a larger chunk, over 50% of economic growth couldn't be explained by capital and labor, but they just assigned it to be total factor productivity or exogenous technical change was what they assigned to it. But still, they believed and they pursued the idea that capital and labor were the two things that essentially make our economic outputs. Even though in the paper himself, Robert Solow said you need a willing suspension of disbelief to talk seriously of the aggregate production function. And yet that's exactly what mainstream economists have been using to explain and try and predict economic growth in the future. When we get to the 1970s, there was a kind of bit of a fight went on. So this is the era of the oil crisis, and suddenly energy analysts became more important. They were being spoken to by policymakers, and the economists felt a bit upset at that. So there was these sort of papers that were being produced then. So in this case, they said the object of this paper is a critical appraisal from the economist point of view of what now appears to be called energy analysis, but one time was energy budgeting. So in this sense, they're kind of saying, well, you know, you used to count energy each year, energy flows, that's fine. We call that energy budgeting, but now you want to be a bit more involved with policymakers, and that's called energy analysis. However, the paper says in their view that they've looked at energy analysis and it fails to achieve its stated purposes, and that economic analysis, remember, with capital and labor, already provides a rational base for planning energy use, making energy analysis either superfluous or misleading. So you can start to see how the mainstream sort of economic models have kind of ignored the role of energy and continue to largely to this day. So even into the 2000s now, we have more of this kind of stuff coming out where we might be looking at changes in growth for different sectors. These are economic sectors, just in the way they're classified. But the important thing to look at is what is the gray stuff. So this is multifactor productivity. Essentially, this is growth that economists can't explain through labor and capital. And so in a sense, their models commonly only explain a minority of economic growth, but they continue to ignore the role of energy in economic growth on the economic side. And so with that, it means that when they start to look at sort of reductions in GDP in large OECD type economies, they're like thinking, okay, what could be the reason for that? And so they start to look at the idea of labor productivity as the cause and therefore the solution. Although there's an interesting point as to whether actually the global economy itself is stuck in a low growth trap, whether you and me would actually call this a low growth trap when, if we look at the world level here, even in 2015, 16, 17, before the recent COVID stuff, we were at a world GDP growth level at 3% per year. Now remember that if you take 70 and divide that by the growth rate of 3%, that gives you the doubling rate. So roughly every 25 years, so 70 over 3, nearly 25 for simplicity, every 25 years you'll be doubling GDP. That means, remember that energy and materials are linked to GDP really closely. So actually what you're doing is doubling energy and material throughput every 25 years. So that's 2, 4, 8, 16. So in 100 years at that growth rate, we will need 16 times as much energy, 16 times as much materials as we did, as we currently do now. So I'd have a slight contention that we are not really stuck in a low growth trap, but only if you view things through a kind of the last 50-year lens and you happen to be a mainstream economist. Anyway, I digress slightly. So labor productivity is seen as being the bad guy. And if we improve labor productivity measures, then suddenly GDP will rebound and we'll all start growing rapidly again. But I think that we are continue to miss the role of energy in economic growth. And if we include adequately the role of energy and efficiency and rebound in economic growth, we get to see a much clearer explanation as to the role not only of energy, but of how small the role of potentially capital and particularly more recently labor are in economic growth. Okay, back on the sort of energy side, the second kind of fallacy I guess I'm putting forward is that common energy efficiency metrics are measuring and including energy efficiency properly in energy models. So in other words, we've got a really good way of estimating what energy efficiency is, and obviously that's going to be included in energy models, because if you want to improve energy efficiency, then you're going to have a way of turning that dial in energy models to understand the reduction in energy that might happen in the future. But actually wrong, because most energy models and most ways of measuring energy efficiency are actually measuring energy intensity. So we have here a couple of examples. This is one for the steel industry, which is energy divided by tons of output. And so tons of output slightly increases faster than energy use, and therefore these numbers start to go down. And we see the same thing at an economy-wide level, because not all sectors of the economy produce, in this case, steel or tons of output. So you can measure it in a similar way by energy supply in energy units divided by the growth, divided by GDP, whether it be on a national or a global level. And again, remember, energy grows, but not quite as fast as GDP, and therefore these trend lines always tend to go down, and economists stand back and say, that's fantastic, we're covering the economy really well, and energy efficiency is improving, even though we know that energy is still actually increasing at an absolute level. These are metrics for energy intensity. And so an alternative way that I, along with sort of other researchers in the last 10 or 15 years, have been developing, building on much of the work done by Bob Ayres, who pioneered a lot of this stuff, is to look at economy-wide measures of thermodynamic-based efficiency using something called Exergy Analysis. So, which is just a kind of more technical, thermodynamically precise way of measuring energy. So we have energy flows, we measure them at 3 stages: primary, final, and useful. So the primary energy flows are kind of like, think of it as being like coal and oil and gas that you can dig out of the ground before you do anything with it. Then it's turned into a finished fuel, which might be here, which is like electricity or petrol, gasoline, gas to your home, stuff like that. And then the final fuel is then consumed by your kind of energy converting device and is then turned into the kind of energy service. And if we measure the amount of energy that's actually produced by light, in this case, and divide it by the primary energy input, we actually get a thermodynamic measure of the useful energy output divided by the primary energy input, just as at the last point, in a sense, of its exchange for energy services. And traditional energy analysis of the sort done by the sort of the IA will record stuff at the primary and final stage, but by pushing through to the useful stage, we get a much clearer understanding of the purpose and end use of energy, and a much clearer understanding of what a thermodynamic measure of energy efficiency is for a whole economy. Let's take an example. Let's have a look at a car. So here we've got 3 stages I'm putting up here. So we've got a primary stage, which is like digging the oil up. We've got the gasoline that's going into the car. Remember, that's the final energy. And then we've got moving the car forward. That's the kind of the energy service that you want, is to get from A to B. And so we have this system diagram of a car, and the fuel goes into the car, but only around 20% of the fuel that goes into the car is actually moving the car forward. This is the useful measure of energy, what we call the useful exergy metric. So if we take this measure of 20% of the fuel that goes in and divide it by the energy content of the oil, we get an overall thermodynamic measure for that particular device, as being a car, but we've previously looked at the light. And so if we look at all the different conversion devices across in the residential sector, so we each have something around 20 or 30 devices in our homes. If we look at transport, industry, commercial sector, heating, cooling, all that stuff, look at how much useful exergy each of these devices is producing for our own energy service, and divide that by the energy inputs, we get an idea at a national scale of what thermodynamic efficiency is. And that's what we've been, I guess, essentially doing for lots of different countries in the last 10 or so years. And as I say here, the good news is we're getting a lot more economy-wide primary final useful energy or exergy data sets are existing. So here we have some of the work by John Cullen, who produced stuff looking at global flows and estimated that at a useful stage, we have only around 55 exajoules of energy that we are usefully consuming back in 2005. Divide that by the primary energy input, so 55 over 475 is about, let's say, 12%. So around 12% is the overall thermodynamic efficiency of the whole world economy in that estimate. So much lower than you might think, because you tend to think of final stage energy being actually the energy that you're using, but you're not. You're buying it, but you're actually converting it through an energy conversion device for the energy service that you actually want. Okay, I digress. Okay, so now we've got, let's say that we've now got quite a few now different countries that we've looked at, and we can progress through to try and unpick the role of efficiency in economic growth and what the scale of rebound might be. So the first step is we start to plot aggregate efficiencies. This is kind of like a timeline of the work that we've been doing. So 5 or so years ago, we were at this kind of stage. We were plotting aggregate primary to useful energy efficiencies, if you like, between the different countries. So the green and the red lines show the industrialized OECD countries, which was slowing down in the case of the UK, or actually slowed almost to a standstill in the case of the US. And the reason for that is efficiency dilution. So the use of more less efficient processes. So the growth of ICT, the growth of air conditioning, particularly in the US, saturation of that market, means they were using more less efficient processes. So each device was getting a little bit more efficient, but they were stepping down the efficiency ladder. Whereas in China, we were showing the situation where it's moved from an agricultural to an industrial superpower in essentially 40 years. But in itself, when we plot the next few years of this, we actually start to see this slowing down as well. And so we start to gain the idea that there may be a practical kind of limit to primary to useful energy, or Exergy thermodynamic efficiency. And that the periods of, then we start to look at this and think, okay, that's interesting. Actually, the fact that these countries are now starting to slow down their efficiency while this other one is growing, does that mean that that could be tied to economic growth somehow? And so we start to plot that. In the next pieces of work that we've been doing, we've been looking at how the energy efficiency measured in a thermodynamic basis could be linked or can be plotted against GDP growth to see if there was any possible relationship that might exist. And interestingly, we picked two countries to study. We looked at Ghana and we looked at the UK. And Ghana is growing quite quickly now. It didn't in the past. It went through various coups and oppressive regimes, and so it went backwards in terms of its GDP, but it also went backwards in terms of its efficiency. So when we plot annual changes, again, remember these are growth rates. Okay, so we've got 5%, 10% growth rate per year in both efficiency in this scale, and we've got GDP, similar to the plot that we saw earlier. So Ghana exhibits a much broader range, but essentially they both show quite interesting characteristics, that there appear to be some kind of correlation between efficiency gains in certain years and economic growth. So going back to the previous slide where we see China growing rapidly, if it's got this space where it has an efficiency kind of headroom, if you like, if it hasn't reached the saturation level yet, then maybe efficiency could be a key part of how economic growth plays out. So that was another second step that we've been doing in our kind of Exergy economics community. And now for a third step, we're now starting to take our kind of shiny energy data, this primary final useful data, and actually plug it within an integrated energy economy model. And so we built a model called MARCO UK, which is our macroeconometric resource consumption model. And it consists of over 60 equations and around 80 socioeconomic and other variables tied together through a system of essentially statistical equations, which have been based on data in the past. And then we can use that for forecasting in the future. We can do ex post and ex ante simulation analysis. And this is a kind of a snapshot of the messy structure of what it looks like, but essentially the equations, the variables all rely on each other, and they're tested on historical stuff. So it's not really built on a theoretical, as much of a theoretical basis. It's an econometric model which is based on real values and real relationships, which are tested and only hold true if those co-integration relationships prove to be valid. And importantly, we kept, not only did we place energy at the heart of the model, or this blue space here, but we put the final to useful energy flows through efficiency and useful Exergy right at the heart of the model, and had that as the key link to the rest of the economy, because we find closer historical links between the useful stage of energy and economic growth than the final stage, because in a way it's closest to the energy service that you're requiring. Okay, what did we find? We found several interesting things. We found that if we remove efficiency gains from the UK, so we ran an ex post analysis, so we looked backwards, and if we keep efficiency the same as it was in 1971, we see 1/4 lower economic growth. So in other words, put it the other way, as I say here, the first insight that we found was that 1/4 of economic growth we could put towards the case that this is thermodynamic efficiency gains that have caused this increase in economic growth. And if economic growth has gone up, energy use has gone up. So in other words, efficiency gains in this case are causing increases to energy that would not be the case if those efficiency gains had not come in. And secondly, we unpicked a little bit more about why that may be the case within our model. looking at how energy rebound could be taking place. So we had rebound occurring through different mechanisms, through a consumer-sided effect. So you save money on your car by buying more fuel-efficient cars, so you drive further. Looking at the costs of goods for producers, which incentivizes production to sell more things more cheaply. Capital investment feeding back in, which then increases efficiency, increases energy services, and then a kind of a complementary set of consumption expenditure. So at a personal level, once I've bought one new iPhone, I don't have an iPhone, but if I did, that would actually increase my chances of buying something else as well. And on a production side, knowing that the kind of marginal propensity to consume is the way that economists think about $1 invested in the economy ripples through the economy and creates further economic growth. So this other strand kind of captured that mechanism. So we have three different strands feeding into our model, largely helping us to understand the size of energy rebound in the model. And so lastly, we can get to the idea of how large economy-wide rebound could exist as a plausible explanation for why energy and GDP is coupled together. So the idea of energy rebound here, we have direct, indirect, and macroeconomic rebound. So direct, as I say, is this driving the car further. Indirect is taking some of your fuel savings and spending them on something else. And then the macroeconomic stuff is how the wider economy responds to these micro rebound situations. And this has been around for over 150 years, since Stanley Jevons first noticed it with the Scottish coal mining industry, that more energy efficient devices were being put into the mines to pump water out, but that was leading to an increase in energy because they could now mine more and more quickly, and so they actually needed more energy for those coal mining machines than they previously did when they thought the energy would go down. Over the last 10 or so years, again, there's been a lot of growth in studies investigating large rebound, and I think we're finding more and more evidence that large rebound actually does exist, or at least plausibly could exist. So this is just highlighting stuff from the paper that we're publishing in the next couple of weeks. So we looked at over 30 studies. It was a kind of a meta-analysis of rebounds estimates, and the average estimate was somewhere over around 50 to 60% in terms of the economy-wide rebound. If we add up all of this rebound, the rebound that they were finding was over 50%, nearly 60% on average. And actually, you could argue that is down to the model construction, because if the models were able to look for even more rebound and they were constructed differently, then they could find potentially more rebound paths existing, as our Marco model did, estimating over 100% rebound. So the efficiency was causing economy and energy to grow. We also looked inside the models themselves to see how and where do they have rebound effects occurring. And what we found was that in quite a lot of the models, they don't include many of the rebound effects. They're pretty good at covering direct rebound, a little bit better, a little bit less good at indirect, and the macroeconomic stuff was largely missing. So in other words, on one side, we found evidence that large rebound exists. On the other side, we're finding evidence that the rebound paths themselves are not included properly in these energy models. And GDP tends to be quite exogenous, so it tends to have a very weak link to the energy module. So hence, GDP can continue to grow, but energy doesn't get pulled along with it. Okay, so I'm near the end. So I'm going to close by kind of questioning, okay, so that all sounds fine, Paul. Okay, right. So we realize that's not very good, but what should we do in response? So I'm going to just sort of say, well, actually, there's probably some things to think about before you get to the next stage. To think, if you were kind of a policymaker, about how should we measure energy efficiency, and the fact that we've got lots of measures for physical and economic lenses for energy efficiency, but not much in terms of thermodynamics. So I think we probably need more indicators which are thermodynamically based. We also need to consider how large is the energy rebound effect, because if it's only partial rebound, let's say 30% rebound, well, you could respond potentially by just increasing the level of policies, so in order to compensate for the partial rebound effect. But if it's backfire, if it's over 100%, then the more and more energy efficiency policies you bring in, unless you design them differently, will actually increase energy use, not reduce them. And lastly, is energy rebound actually a good or a bad thing? Because at the moment, I think I've kind of you probably had the view that, well, efficiency, obviously that's a good thing, lots of benefits, blah, blah. But rebound, that's kind of like the bad guy. It's kind of like the good, bad twin thing going on. And the energy rebound is maybe a bad thing. Maybe we need to cut out the rebound, but maybe we do, maybe we don't, because actually, in terms of the growth of energy rebound in the past, it's enabled a breadth of energy services worldwide. People that have access to lighting and technologies and energy services that without rebound existing, they wouldn't have access to. So in some ways, it's actually been a very good thing. Although what we're finding is that there's an environmental trade-off, right? Energy's increased, greenhouse gas emissions have increased. So rebound itself is not necessarily a bad thing. It's maybe about how you control it. That could be something else to think about. And so if I had to bet, what would I do? Well, the first thing I would do is to have a better inclusion in modeling of efficiency and rebound. And I'd have at least some scenarios which without this kind of strong decoupling. In other words, that exhibit historical energy GDP relationships. Because if you got that, remember the wedges diagram we had earlier on, if efficiency isn't working very well at all, then it means renewables and these other dials are going to work a lot harder. And that's important to know as policymakers. So you need to go as hard as you can on renewables. Inclusion of rebound. Okay, so if you are having to take rebound into account, then you're looking at things like carbon taxes in order to stop the rebound getting back into the economy. And you're also potentially setting higher efficiency targets if you're in a partial rebound space, as well as I think focusing much more on demand-sided reduction. So a lot of sort of efficiency devices in some ways are sort of reaching some of the technical limits of their penetration. So I think we're looking much more about the demand side, looking at building massive urgent building retrofits to actually shut down the level of energy efficiency, shut down the level of energy use, and then to try and capture those savings and put them back into, for example, the design of increasing amounts of renewables, looking at material strategies, so looking at circular economy stuff, so less energy, but actually less material throughput should reduce energy. And also potentially going back to the GDP question right at the very start, looking at sufficiency and saying, actually, can we design our systems so that we're staying within planetary boundaries? We don't necessarily need to focus on GDP. Let's just focus on sufficiency of energy services and material services. And then GDP and this growth obsessive stuff goes out the window. And then finally, going back to what we said earlier, we probably need lots more renewables as well. We certainly don't want to take the foot off the pedal, because if efficiency isn't working as well as we hope, we're going to need even more renewables even more quickly in order to meet Paris. So I think I'll stop there. I've got some references just at the end of the slides that you can take with you. But essentially, this is our little research group. I guess it's an informal network of around 40 or so researchers. So you'd be welcome to come and hang out. We meet every quarter or so online and discuss some projects and things that we're working on. So that's the link to the Exergy Economics website, and that's the link to my decoupling project. So I will stop talking now and hand the questions back to Carrie, to Marshall. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Good work, good job. So we have a couple of questions on here, so we have room for other questions if you'll have them. So one of your slides showed the difference between, I guess, aggregated developed countries and less developed or developing countries. And then you showed a comparison of Ghana and the UK, I think. So one of these questions was just a little bit more about the difference between, and you showed global data, of course, the difference between stages of development, implying that, let's just say for the United States, we've had constant primary energy consumption now for roughly almost 20 years or maybe 20 years. So, have we absolutely decoupled or at least stagnated, or, how should we think about the different types of countries?
Yeah, so I guess if you go back to if we go back to this kind of efficiency headroom idea that we've kind of introduced. So the countries that are closest to that kind of stagnating efficiency seem to be, if efficiency is I've argued is a kind of a key contributor to economic growth, as was historically the case in the UK, then by the same token, if efficiency gains are starting to slow down, then that would also coincide with a period of economic growth slowing down. So for countries which have have this headroom space like China and like Ghana, where I think Ghana's efficiency was around just over 10% and growing. So it has a lot more space to increase its economic growth, because part of economic growth, yes, capital, yes, labor, but actually, yes, actually a large part is also due to energy efficiency gains. So if we don't have those energy efficiency gains, then we're kind of biophysically constrained on a thermodynamic basis that we can't expand the economy as much as we would want. In terms of the stagnation for energy consumption in the US, and actually the UK's has gone down. Well, obviously there's quite a lot of studies have gone on to look at the energy flows between countries. So we obviously import in the UK a lot of goods from overseas, particularly from countries like China. So on a consumption basis, actually our energy reductions are not quite as fantastic as they look, and they're much closer to kind of quite a stable energy flows. So I think that's part of the puzzle kind of as well, is taking into account not just this kind of territorial assessment for energy consumption, energy efficiency, but some of the work we're going to start to move into, I think, in the next couple of years is start to look at consumption-based assessments for flows of Exergy and efficiency kind of between borders.
All right, I think some papers I've read, yeah, so GDP takes into account imports and exports, but the energy consumption, people usually don't take into account imports. So if you count the energy consumption associated with the imports and exports, then, for example, the US would show an increased energy consumption over the last 20 years rather than stagnant. Okay, so that's that question. Another one is just a question here on, I guess there's a lot of, you showed the energy projections from different models used to inform IPCC and others. And these generally, as you stated, have a assumed GDP and energy relationship rather than one solved, I guess, internally in the model. So this is just a question here on how could we or how should we update energy projections? Maybe this gets a little bit into your recommendations at the end. I don't know how much it's the same, which is use models that are correct. But how, maybe just restate how we should maybe do energy projections and then go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I guess ideally I'd like to be able to, the models to be a bit more opened up so that we can see it inside, because some of them are a little bit black box. When you look at the model literature, there's not a lot of description in terms of how rebound is calculated. But again, if they're not including a kind of a thermodynamic measure of efficiency, energy efficiency in the model, if it's something related to energy divided by some tons of steel input, for example, for the steel industry, well, that's a kind of physical intensity, which is what I was talking about earlier on. So I think one of the, if it's not possible to really deconstruct and put the model back together very differently, a bit like we saw with the Marco model, where energy and thermodynamic changes from final to useful were absolutely at the heart of the model. If it's not possible, just because these models are now, in some cases very large and very, not old, but in terms of they've had a long development time, and it's just not possible to change it in that way. I guess in that sense, it's probably better to look at put in the rebound channels that you can, and then in some cases rather than run all your scenarios with variations, but still having this kind of disconnect between energy and GDP, run some scenarios where actually you're following the historical path. So you're following this black line. And if that's true, then I think other policy measures are going to be recommended rather than just let's have lots of energy efficiency, which is kind of blue wedge. If this blue wedge in some model runs doesn't work very well or doesn't work at all, then this other stuff is going to have to work super hard and even harder than it is now. And I think that's my probably, with my old engineering hat on, I'd be like, okay, well, if we can't change the model that much, I'd at least like to see some model runs where energy and GDP are much tighter together. So, and then it will give policymakers the idea that, okay, maybe there's a chance this efficiency stuff isn't working properly. And then how do we respond to that? Maybe we bring in this kind of carbon taxation idea, or we start to look at other ideas for how efficiency might be delivered through, as I say, kind of passive system retrofits for housing, or we look at how we can switch to moving even faster with the push through to renewables. But in some ways, and again, there's nearly 50 of us online. If they're all the IEM modelers, then I'm in trouble. But what I'm going to say is that my sense is that having looked at the IPCC material and having looked at the reports and having looked at the sheer bulk of these models, it's a very incumbent system. So when you're sitting on the outside, this isn't really me just trying to moan and say, hang on, nobody's listening to me, you know, I'm the bad guy at the party who turns up and says, hang on, efficiency might not be working. I guess what I'm saying is that if the IPCC, if these modelers are the ones who are informing the IPCC process, and yet they're all attending conferences and workshops together and saying, oh, here's my model. Oh, yes, your model is very similar. Therefore, just because these half dozen or so incumbent models produce very similar results, it doesn't mean that they're right. It just means that they're built on fundamentally the same assumptions. And what I'm saying is that those assumptions are not necessarily correct. And for something like this, which is super important, if we've got the efficiency dial wrong, if we're assuming that efficiency is going to reduce energy, and it's not only the blue line, but potentially in this sense that it's actually going up because of the efficiency rebound thing, then that's a super important thing. And if you were kind of a betting person, you'd at least want to have some chips on the other color. And I think where I'm with, because I'm too small a person and our community is too small to take on the integrated assessment models. And so we've started developing energy economy models through econometrics to try and show how energy and efficiency could be much more closely linked to the economy. And if we can find a better engagement path with the integrated assessment people, they might see a way where they can start to improve their models, expand the space, include efficiency, as well as run some scenarios where energy and GDP are much more tightly linked.
Right. So let me try
a very long answer to a short question.
Yeah, let me see if I can summarize. One is use existing integrated assessment models without assuming decoupling, but using historical relationship between primary energy and GDP is just another scenario in some sense. Two, try to learn from persons like yourselves or others if there is a way to adapt the existing models. So those are at least two pathways. So plug myself, my book, The Economic Superorganism, touches on this policy implication that Paul brings up in chapter 6. So, which gets us to another question here. Essentially, okay, this person is saying, yeah, okay, I agree. I think energy rebound is a thing. And if we're concerned about greenhouse gas mitigation, you gave some recommendations on your final slide, which I thought was great. And maybe some of them were saying this, I can't quite remember. What should you do with, can you measure, here's the rebound effect we have, here's the extra energy we have to consume now. What are we going to do with it? Traditionally, we just build more stuff and consume more things. But how this person is asking, could we specifically figure out how much that is and put it towards, environmental preservation or carbon sequestration or things that are specifically related to greenhouse gas reduction instead of just, regular economic output, if you will. How do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I'd say, yes, we need to, take the carbon taxation stuff, put it into more renewables. So you're diverting it straight away. You're not just building more roads. Stop automatically all of your new, obviously we need to constrain our infrastructure. We can't just keep building more roads and then that's going to just encourage more people to drive further. So yeah, we have to place restrictions on that. I think that makes sense. So people start to live within those means, but also I think switching to things like the demand side of the interventions, looking at massive building retrofit programs, looking at the kind of avoid shift improve framework. So we're looking at moving people away from their cars into greener forms of transport, cycling, walking, all that kind of stuff. I think has a role to play, but I think it just needs to be badged with analyses which try to sort of, if you can try to understand how and where those rebound paths occur, you can try to maybe put some interventions in which are going to help prevent those rebound paths occurring and then helping the economy to grow again. So, but absolutely, I think taking advantage of the efficiency so that we can divert those savings into kind of these other dials that we've got in terms of renewables and CCS and reforestation, I think is absolutely where we should be moving.
Okay. I'll ask a question here. It's a little on my front. You talked about, one of your slides had a summary of what computable general equilibrium models can or tend to show in terms of the rebound. And I guess you were saying that they they tend to show some correct effects, if I interpreted correctly. And of course, you're talking about integrated assessment models as well. So is there any overlap of, let's just say, integrated assessment models used and CGEs? Are some of them CGE models? Are they generally not at all, and so they don't capture the effect? Or is there some fundamental disconnect on why?
No, I think they are linked. I mean, the CGE model stuff we looked at, that's what we looked at those when we looked at, okay, who's done an assessment for whole economy rebound, and 2/3 of the studies that we found, of the 33 that we looked at, 21 were from CG models. So this is where you would have kind of capital, labor, and you would have energy. So going back to that Cobb Douglas Robert Solow function, you would have potentially capital, labor, and energy, but energy is a kind of a weak substitute for capital and labor. So if you saved energy, it would make the economy grow a little bit, but in some ways, in the way those CG models are constructed with the relationship between energy and the economy, it's very difficult for those. It's easy for those models to find some rebound, and I was surprised that they found as much as they did, but it's very difficult for them to find increases of energy above 100% because they're constrained by this kind of substitutability idea between energy and the other factors of production. With the integrated assessment models, they tend to have, sometimes they can have interactions with this type of production function, this kind of capital, labor, energy production function, but often GDP growth is just exogenous to the model, and so it's just imposed on the model, and the relationship between energy and GDP is not even as good as it is with the CG models. So I think that could be one step that the IEAM models could do, is to improve their connection to energy. And if they did, you wouldn't necessarily have to have as many, what I would sort of call artificial scenarios, where you're artificially constraining energy and GDP together in a historical sense, because if you had the proper connection between energy and GDP, that would be the default. The default would be this tight connection, unless there was some policy mechanism to break that open. Whereas at the moment, they're freely allowed to break, and it's only me and others that are saying, well, hang on, that kind of doesn't really make sense. So yes, they are kind of connected in that they have a relationship between energy and the economy, but the CG ones tend to have a slightly stronger relationship. I think that's why we find more rebound, but equally they don't have as good a connection to the economy as we would hope, and therefore they're not able to find much rebound that's over 100%.
Okay, so if I clarify, so when you reported a 50% rebound from CGE studies, that would be like saving 1 unit of energy and by efficiency, but only increasing, having a rebound of 0.5. So you actually still decrease total energy consumption, but we're observing in the real data that in that type of metric, you would have a metric of over 100%, meaning I saved a unit of energy, and in the end, I consumed more energy than I saved. Is that the right statement?
Yes, exactly. Whereas with the market model that we did, now again, you can criticize the CG models, as I've just done. You can also criticize the econometric model, which is what we built, because in a way, all models will tell you essentially how you built them. And so we built it to allow energy and efficiency to breathe and to give us the rebound that we felt would the model would tell us, if you see what I mean, because we had those paths open, it gave us a lot higher rebound than the CG models, where some of those larger macroeconomic rebound channels are closed, and therefore you can't see rebound over 100%. So as with all these things, all models are wrong, etc. It's just, I think with the studies that we did, I mean, all those studies have been produced in the last, I think, 13 years that we surveyed. I think as models move and hopefully allow more rebound paths to be found and allow, I guess, energy and efficiency to have a more involved role in the economy, that in effect you've got a bigger pan for prospecting and you're likely to find more rebound. Just because we found an average of 50 to 60% rebound with those 30 studies, I don't think tells us that rebound is 50, 60%. I think it tells us it's at least 50 to 60%. And if the model construction changes, we're likely to find more.
Right, so we'll perhaps end it there. All models, well, maybe we have one more question. So yeah, all models are wrong. The question is, how wrong is each model, I guess, or, for your purposes. So we'll go with this last one. Just kind of read it off, I guess. Claim energy efficiency causes increased energy consumption. This person is saying is inappropriate, is an inappropriate attribution of causality Direct rebound is limited. For example, more efficient refrigerators and televisions do not cause increased usage, certainly in the house. So the argument depends on indirect rebound, which you mentioned. An alternative explanation of the apparent indirect rebound is that aggregate energy increases over time due to increasing development and incomes, causing increased purchases and usage of additional energy using products. Is that, to me, it sounds like perhaps that's what you discussed, that the increased energy consumption comes because we build more products effectively, but go ahead on this causality question.
Yeah, so we've got this this kind of triangle here. So the direct stuff, as you say, is the increased use of cars or lighting. We leave it on for longer. And studies, there's quite a lot of empirical studies, so people can measure how much further people drive, or how much they have the heating on more, or how much they have the lighting on more. The indirect stuff is generally captured through kind of cross-price elasticity work. So they know that if I spent my money on car usage, and if I save money, then the studies will know which sector I'm going to spend on. Maybe I'll go and buy more clothes, or maybe I'll save up my money and take a holiday, etc. So they can then associate some energy use with that captured saving. But because I'm still taking the energy, I'm still taking my my car from A to B, I'm still doing those trips, but I've also got other things going as well. So we've got this kind of macroeconomic ripple effect that causes the whole economy to grow when energy efficiency is implemented, and particularly on the producer side. So with me, it's just a light bulb or a car, but with a producer, it's actually a factory that's producing widgets, and the fact that you've got more efficient machines means you can make more widgets more cheaply, sell them more quickly. So instead of putting one more energy efficient machine in 1 year, you might actually put another energy efficient machine in next year, because you've increased production, and suddenly people wanting to buy more of those goods more cheaply, because suddenly the price of these widgets come down, and thereby increasing demand. So there are many complex mechanisms for rebound, and I think we've only really understand quite well these first two. The macroeconomic one is the least well understood, and it's the one that the CG and other models have really struggled to capture properly, and hence I believe that those 50 to 60% estimates are potentially an underestimate of the true magnitude of energy rebound, which goes back to understanding why energy and GDP are so tightly coupled currently and historically in the first place.
Right. So the challenge, yeah, don't believe the models or believe the data, and if the models can't replicate the data, then we probably have a good evidence to know our models are wrong. So, okay, Dr. Paul Brockway, University of Leeds, thank you very much for the Energy Symposium today. So this concludes my presentation. Paul, thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.